Alright, welcome to another edition of Lizard Landscapes. In this video, I've got a fake tree background for a lizard cage. Done quite a few other backgrounds. This is a little different. Someone suggested that I do a taller cage background, so a cage that, or a background that is meant for a cage that is more tall than wide. So I thought a tree would be ideal for that idea. So I did another tree years ago, like 2009 or 10, but this is a little bit different than that. So got a couple of hides, one on the bottom, one on obviously the top there with that hole in the tree. So this is really more for your expert climbers. So certain types of lizards, tarantulas. You could obviously make this for a terrarium, but this is sealed with a certain type of sealant that is water resistant. Fits into a 10-gallon cage, but obviously you could scale this up to a much bigger cage, or if you have a smaller cage than this. So it fits right in there. And usually I make these backgrounds whereby you can remove them, so it's a little bit more sanitary as far as cleaning. So be sure and check out the second and third channel. Second channel, I've started a series of how to draw, where the first video is where I do a self-portrait. And be sure and check out the third channel, which is a Christian channel. So let's get started. First of all, you want to have some sort of protective device that you wear, protects you from the dust. I used to wear that white one, but have graduated to a much more safe breathing apparatus, protects you from the dust and the fumes. So I'm set up near an open window because I'm going to be using some tools from the hot wire foam factory. So I've got actually 3 different tools. I'm just showing 2 right here, but I've got another one, a newer one, that I'll introduce later in the video. So using these tools to cut through polystyrene foam. So I've got this 10-gallon tank here turned on its end, and I'm assuming you've got a cage that's really meant for this. This is just to be able to show you a background that is more tall than wide. But measuring out the base of the background here, and just I'm using a sheet of polystyrene. Just got this at the hardware store. All of the materials are on a materials list video that's on the channel. Cutting through this with one of the hot wires, going to go ahead and cut along that other black line, and trying to fit this back into the cage, realizing that it wasn't perfectly measured out. What you want to do is measure it out so that it's a little bit smaller than the back of the cage. So cutting a little bit off there, like a 1/4 inch, and making sure that I can fit this back into the cage and that there's a little bit of play. So like a 1/4 inch, something like that, on both sides, just to ensure that you can fit this back into the cage. So I'm going to trace around this piece that I know is going to fit, because I'm doing another project at the exact same time as this one. Then I'm going to trace around a much larger, much thicker piece of polystyrene. So I'm going to trace around this because I know that thinner piece fits. And I've got the one of the hot wires, again from the hot wire foam factory, and I'm going to try to bevel these edges. And you can certainly do this with a knife, but it is obviously much easier with the hot wire, and there's essentially no mess when you use a hot wire such as these. I'm going to create or get another piece, cut out another piece of the thicker foam. Go ahead and cut that out the exact same length, and this wire is obviously off at this moment. bending it into a shape where it's an even more dramatic bevel, because I'm kind of wanting the second shape to bevel in more than that first one. So there's how that is looking. So this is currently being held together with little small nails, and I'm going to try to mark where each piece is meeting the other piece, so I'll know exactly where to line them up when I finally decide to glue them together. So here's one of those little nails holding it together. These allow you to hold a project together without committing to gluing it together in case you want to make a change at some point. So I'm marking those little areas so that I know exactly where to glue those pieces together. And applying a little bit of glue, not too much glue, because you really don't need that much to keep these, all three of these pieces of polystyrene stuck together. So putting a little bit on there, just enough to keep them together. Gluing that onto the, I really didn't have to use that first initial smaller, thinner piece, but I thought I might as well just glue it on there and use it. So gluing the top thicker piece onto the other two. So you can see with the black lines being able to line them up perfectly with the other pieces. So I've got one of the flexible tools from the hot wire foam factory. I'm going to carve out that bottom hide that you saw in the beginning of the video in the finished tree. So just carving this out, trying to essentially gut it, and I end up going a little bit left with it as far as the shape of the hide. But you really could hollow this out, leaving maybe an inch or so that it has some stability on all sides. But beveling some of the edges to suggest more of a rounded look, because those are essentially, I guess, the parts of the root. And I end up building up on that left side of the root later in the video. So I've got that all carved out, that initial bottom hide. So I'm going to take some of the hot wires and go through and try to start really carving out the shape that the tree will ultimately form. So this is a much easier, even though I use the knife later in the video, much easier to use the hot wire. There's essentially no mess when you do this. I'm going to start drawing out the top hole to the tree. So another hide that you can create. So drawing out a basic shape there, just with a little magic marker, and then instead of using the hot wire, just to show you, you can in fact use a knife for pretty much most of this. It's just a little bit more difficult, and there's quite a bit of mess. So using a knife to carve out that top hide in the tree, and picking out some large chunks there just ends up taking a little bit of time, a little bit more time with the knife than with the hot wire. And what I'm trying to do is what I did with the bottom hide is leave a good inch towards the top, not trying to get too close to breaking that or breaking through that level, so that it's got some stability. So you can see there's a good sized chunk there. Even though there's quite a bit of space, I've left a little bit of, or enough styrofoam for it to still be a strong finished project. So with the knife, I guess carving out really kind of a suggestion of bark, or at least the beginnings of a little bit of bark, a little bit of texture. Going along with that main root at the bottom of the tree. And really just showing you that you can use the knife to, you can see right there, you could essentially say that's a finished product and ready to be foam coated. But got way into the bark texture later, but gluing on right now and it's sort of an extension of that root to the tree. So taking the sculpting tool, another hot wire that this is the first time I've used this one, and going through trying to create a little bit of a bark texture. So really you're creating grooves and moving that wire back and forth to create more of a texture than you would if you were just kind of going through it without any motion, I guess. So this really is fairly easy to do. I'm looking at some reference photos of trees and bark and whatnot to be able to get some ideas. But I've got that left side of the tree kind of carved out as far as the bark. And I've left the other side, even though I get into it later, without bark, just so you can see the difference. And like I was saying earlier, you really could, it kind of, is suggesting bark because it's got some grooves and texture in it. You really could save yourself a lot of time and just move on to the next stage instead of creating all this bark. So there is how it is looking with both sides fleshed out as far as the texture of the bark is concerned. Making sure I can still fit this back into the cage. And I had a little bit of trouble fitting this back into the cage later on into the project, but it had quite a bit of a gap there. I guess I just got a little out of control with the foam coat and creating the layers. But this is the mortar stage. I'm using foam coat, again from the hot wire foam factory. It comes with instructions. It's basically a 3 parts powder to 1 part water. I end up using a little bit more water than what their instructions suggest. You'll want to apply a good coat or two if you're creating this for a living creature, and I say that because some people are creating it for just a random terrarium. But if you're creating this for a pet, you'll want to at least apply 2 layers of a strengthening agent. So I've used non-sanded grout in the past, but using currently foam coat, it is specifically designed for polystyrene, or at least to be applied to polystyrene. It doesn't crack as much, there's not any flaking, so it's got a little bit of give to it. So what I'm doing is I'm going to try to get to the hard to reach areas first. So you can see that other project there in a different video. I highlight that one. But I've got the project, the fig tree, over top of the bowl, so if any excess drips out, it's going to go right back into the bowl. Plus, I'm trying to cover these problem, difficult to reach areas, which are basically the hides, while the project is still a little bit light. Because with each stroke of the brush, the project becomes a lot heavier because you're adding this mortar to it. So it's better now to get to those problem areas before the project becomes a little bit too heavy. So your arm will really start to feel it, especially when you've gotten to the point where you've covered essentially 3/4 of the project. So moving that around, trying to get that foam coat all covered into that top hole in the tree. And here's what I'm doing is I've covered everything, and I'm just going to kind of stipple the bark to give it texture. So I'm using same foam coat and really just tapping the surface to give that bark some texture, which you'll later see in the painting stage where that'll show up. You'll see the benefit of applying this texture by tapping. So here is the painting stage. First stage of that, what you can do is get a water bottle from a dollar store and put a little bit of acrylic paint. In this case, I think it was like a dark gray, and obviously water. And you've got a really easy way of covering a large surface without much effort. And it's able to get into all those little crevices that you've got if you do this type of bark. And what I ended up having to do was a couple of different layers because I had a little bit too much water in the bottle. It's better to have too much water than too much paint, because if you've got too much paint, it's not going to work its way through the nozzle. So here I am applying the second layer. So, and you can really get into some interesting looks as far as the finished paint is concerned, because you've got this, transparency. You've got paint in there, but you've got water, so it mixes together, and sometimes it's a little bit more faded. And seeing how it's dried here, you've got darker gray areas and then lighter gray areas, depending on how many sprays a particular section got from the water bottle. So it's really just good to get a base coat of something dark as far as a color. In this case, gray, but I could have used a really dark brown or maybe even black or really dark green. So I'm going to mix together a lot of white, a little bit of brown, and a little bit of black to initially start fleshing out the texture. So grabbing a little bit of black there. And really you're just wanting a kind of dull, lighter shade of color that is, I guess, in the neighborhood of kind of a light brown to do this texture. And what I'm doing is a dry brush technique where I'm removing most of the paint from the brush, and then that stippling or tapping I did of the foam coat, which created all that texture, is now revealed when you basically take that brush over the texture. The dry brush, there's a little bit of paint left on the brush, and that texture will kind of pull it off. So you can do this, you can just keep piling up layer after layer of different variations of color. You got a little bit of light. I could have started out maybe with a lighter color and then dry brushed a darker color. But you can see the difference in that it really starts to highlight the texture. You start to really see the grooves in the bark where the brush is not hitting, as opposed to where it's hitting, where a little bit of paint is being pulled off. And you can go back in with, what I did was go back in with several different layers of different colors and different techniques of adding the color. This is essentially a dry brush with green. So going over that, trying to suggest, some moss growing on the tree, using a little bit of brown at this point. So getting a lot of variance of color to apply to this. And here I'm kind of using a almost completely wet brush and just doing a kind of stipple tapping to apply that brown color. And what I'm doing is trying to re-emphasize where that bark is and where it isn't. So taking a really dark color, at this point maybe dark brown or dark green, going in and kind of redefining where the bark is. So this will really give a lot of detail and not a difficult process to do, to add this darker color to like in between those pieces of bark. Sometimes you'll need to go over and reestablish with some dry brush because of so many layers you may have painted on. So going back in and with that texture that is still there, using again a lighter color because the base is darker, and trying to reestablish some of that gnarly texture. So there's how it's looking so far. And another technique you can do is do this kind of sort of stippling, but you're really just creating dots. I've got a really light green color and going in, and again, not difficult because all it is dots. And from a distance, it can really look like you've put a lot of time into the detail of, in this case, trying to create moss. And you can use different colors. You've got obviously the light green, but you can go back in and maybe start doing this exact same thing with black and creating more detail to the texture of the bark. So I've got a giant piece of cardboard here that is going to guard the rest of my room there from getting hit from the sealant. But before then, you can use this product called Bounce from the Hot Wire Foam Factory. I've used this on several other projects, and really it just helps with the impact resistant finish. If you're clumsy like me, you'll end up bumping into walls and stuff. So that really helps with, I guess, the longevity of your project. So here I am sealing it. You can see the other project there. I'm doing it at the exact same time on the right there. I'll be featured in a different video. But sealing this with a non-toxic, water-resistant sealant. So if you've got a pet whereby there's quite a bit of moisture, high humidity in the cage, you really want to use one of these sealants where you seal it up, let it dry for 72 hours, and then keep putting more layers on it, where you've got 72 hours dry time in between each layer. So especially if you're creating this for a living creature, you'll want to do that where you apply a layer of sealant, wait 72 hours, let it cure, apply another one, up to 4 or 5 times, and then you might want to reapply a sealant like every 2 years. So here is sort of a last stage. I've got a little bit of sealant I applied with the brush and then sprinkled fine grained colored sand as a way to counteract the shininess. Plus, you can really build up a really strong basking spot by doing this, where you've got a layer of sealant and then you sprinkle sand, colored sand over top of that, and then just repeat the process. So it's sealant, sand, over and over again to wherever you believe the hot spot or the basking spot of your cage to be, whereby it's going to be on your fake rock structure. So there you have it, fake tree for a taller than wide cage. So be sure and check out that other video that will hopefully be on YouTube at some point. And check out the other channels. And thanks for watching.